Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the topic selection, pattern and mechanism. The main objectives of today's lecture are to know the basics of selection, that is pattern and mechanism, to know the historical development of natural selection, to understand Darwin's concept of natural selection, to know the various mechanisms of natural selection, to understand different patterns of selection, and finally to understand natural selection and the evolution of species. Dear students, let's start with the introduction to selection, pattern and mechanism. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. Organisms that are more adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on the genes that aided their success. This process causes species to change and diverge over time. Natural selection is one of the ways to account for the millions of species that have lived on Earth. Natural selection is one of the central mechanisms of evolutionary change and is the process responsible for the evolution of adaptive features. Natural selection results from the confluence of a small number of basic conditions of ecology and heredity. Often the circumstances in which those conditions apply are of direct significance to human health and well-being, as in the evolution of antibiotic and pesticide resistance, or in the impacts of intense predation by humans. Natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. It is a key mechanism of evolution, the change in the heritable traits or characteristics of a population over generations. Charles Darwin popularized the term natural selection, contrasting it with artificial selection, which in his view is intentional, whereas natural selection is not. Dear students, let's first discuss the historical development of natural selection. Let's start with the pre-Darwinian theories. Several philosophers of the classical era, including Empedocles and his intellectual successor, the Roman poet Lucretius, expressed the idea that nature produces a huge variety of creatures randomly and that only those creatures that manage to provide for themselves and reproduce successfully persist. Empedocles' idea that organisms arose entirely by the incidental workings of causes such as heat and cold was criticized by Aristotle. He posited natural teleology in its place and believed that form was achieved for a purpose, citing the regularity of heredity in species as proof. Nevertheless, he accepted in his Biology, Generation of Animals, Book 4, that new types of animals can occur in very rare instances. As quoted in Darwin's 1872 edition of the Origin of Species book, Aristotle considered whether different forms of teeth might have appeared accidentally, but only the useful forms survived later. The struggle for existence was later described by the Islamic writer Al-Jahiz in the 9th century. The classical arguments were reintroduced in the 18th century by Pierre-Louis Maupertuis and others, including Darwin's grandfather Erasmus. The early 19th century zoologist J.B. Lamarck suggested that the inheritance of acquired characteristics as a mechanism for evolutionary change, adaptive traits acquired by an organism during its lifetime could be inherited by that organism's progeny, eventually causing transmutation of species. He supported his theory by giving the example of long neck of giraffe. Between 1835 and 1837, the zoologist Edward Blyth worked on the area of variation or change, artificial selection, and how a similar process occurs in nature. Darwin acknowledged Blyth's ideas in the first chapter on variation on the origin of species. Dear students, let's now discuss the Darwin's theory. In 1859, Charles Darwin set out his theory of evolution by natural selection as an explanation for adaptation and speciation. He defined natural selection as the principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved. The concept was simple but powerful. Individuals best adapted to their environments are more likely to survive and reproduce. As long as there is some variation between them and that variation is heritable, that is, it is able to pass on to next generation, there will be an inevitable selection of individuals with the most advantageous variation. If the variations or changes are heritable, then differential reproductive success leads to the evolution of particular populations of a species. And populations that evolve to be sufficiently different eventually become different species. Importantly, Darwin didn't just propose that organisms evolved. Instead, Darwin also proposed a mechanism for evolution. This mechanism is elegant and logical, and it explained how populations could evolve in such a way that they became better suited to their environments over time. Dear students, let's now discuss the Darwin's concept of natural selection. Darwin's concept of natural selection is based on several key observations. He observed that in living organisms, many characteristics or traits are inherited or passed on from parents to the offsprings. As Darwin knew this was the case, even though he did not know that traits were inherited via genes as described by Mendel as factors. Organisms are capable of producing more offsprings than their environments can support. Thus, there is competition for limited resources in each generation in terms of food, shelter, habitat, etc. The offspring in any generation will be slightly different from one another in their traits like color, size, shape, etc. And many of these features will be heritable. Dear students, let's now discuss about the modern synthesis theory. Natural selection relies crucially on the idea of heredity, but developed before the basic concepts of genetics were known. Although the Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, the Austrian monk, was a contemporary of Darwin, his work lay in obscurity, only being rediscovered in 1900 by Karl Lorenz, Teschermark, and Hugo de Vries. With the early 20th century integration of evolution with Mendel's laws of inheritance, the so-called modern synthesis, scientists generally came to accept natural selection. Ronald Fisher developed the required mathematical language and wrote the genetical theory of natural selection. Similarly, Haldane introduced the concept of the cost of natural selection. Sewall Wright elucidated the nature of selection and adaptation. In his book Genetics and the Origin of Species in 1937, Theodosius Dobzhansky established the idea that mutation, once seen as a rival to selection, actually supplied the raw material for natural selection by creating genetic diversity. Dear students, let's know some key points about natural selection. Natural selection depends on the environment. Natural selection doesn't favor traits or characters that are somehow inherently superior to one another. Instead, it favors traits that are beneficial, that is, help an organism survive and reproduce more effectively than its peers in a specific environment. Traits that are helpful in one environment might actually be harmful in another environment. Natural selection acts on existing heritable variation. That is, natural selection needs some starting material, and that starting material is heritable variation or change. For natural selection to act on a feature, there must already be variation, that is, differences among individuals for that feature. Also, the differences have to be heritable, that is able to pass on from one generation to another generation and determined by the genes of an organism. Dear students, let's now discuss the heritable variation comes from random mutations. The original source of the new gene variants that produce new heritable traits or characters such as fur colors is random mutation, that is change in DNA sequence. Random mutations that are passed on to offsprings typically occurs in the germline or sperm and egg cell lineage of organisms. Sexual reproduction mixes and matches gene variants to make more variations or changes. Dear students, let's now talk about the mechanisms of natural selection. British scientist Charles Darwin was not the first scientist to explain evolution or recognize that species change over time. However, he gets most of the credit simply because he was the first to publish a mechanism for how evolution happened. This mechanism is what he called natural selection. As time passed, more and more information about natural selection and its different types has been discovered. With the discovery of genetics by Vince Abbott and scientist Gregor Mendel, the mechanism of natural selection became even clearer than when Darwin first proposed it. Let's discuss the different terms. First, the variation. Within a population, we see a wide variety of traits or characters and differences among the same species. All of the traits and phenotypes, that is expressed characteristics, are due to differences in the DNA. These differences in the DNA arise due to mutations or changes. A mutation is any change in an organism's DNA. It can be negative, positive, or neutral. Mutation is caused by spontaneous switching of nucleotide bases in the DNA. Mutation can also be caused by chromosome abnormalities, that is missing parts, moved sections, or inability to separate during cell division, that is the phenomenon of non-disjunction. Variation and sexual reproduction. Sexually reproducing or reproductive animals have the benefit of a greater genetic diversity. An offspring gets one set of chromosomes from the mother and the other from the father. Without variation or change, populations could not survive in changing environments. So natural selection selects the best adapted to survive, leading others to die off. If they all have the same DNA, the population could not survive the same change. The second one, overproduction. Organisms instinctively reproduce. This leads to frequent offspring production among organisms, as frequent as their biology allows. This leads to more offspring produced than just to replace the parents. However, pressures such as environment, predators, etc. lead to the death of many offsprings. Luckily, overproduction means there is a greater chance of some offspring surviving to reproductive age. The third one is competition. Limited food, space, water, mates, and niche in each environment play an important role in organism and its ecosystem. It includes its habitat, where it lives, what it eats, and how it behaves in that ecosystem. This means organisms within a species must compete to survive with each other. If they are not strong enough, they will be outcompeted and can die. There is also interspecies competition, different species competing over the same resource of food, water, habitat, and niche. This leads to extinction of one unless they can adapt themselves to the changing environments in that ecosystem. This is why invasive species are such a problem that can outcompete native species in this competition. Dear students, the fourth one is the survival of the fittest. More variation means some organisms in a population will be better suited or adapted to survive and others worse. The traits or characters that help an animal survive in its environment is called an adaptation. The better adapted organisms in a particular environment, the more likely it will survive and pass on its DNA to the next generation. Dear students, let's now discuss the patterns of natural selection. There are about 5 of the types of selection known today, both natural and not so natural. The first type of natural selection is called directional selection. It derives its name from the shape of the approximate bell curve that is produced when all individuals' traits are plotted. Instead of the bell curve falling directly in the middle of the axis on which they are plotted, it skews either to the left or to the right by varying degrees. Hence, it has moved one direction or other direction. Directional selection curves are most often seen when one external coloring is favored over another for a particular species. This could be to help a species blend into an environment, camouflage themselves from predators, or to mimic another species to trick predators. Other factors that may contribute to one extreme being selected for over the other include the amount and type of food available in that particular environment. Next one is disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is also named for the way the bell curve skews when individuals are plotted on a graph. To disrupt means to break apart, and this is what happens to the bell curve of disruptive selection. Instead of the bell curve having one peak in the middle, disruptive selection graph has 2 peaks with a valley in the middle of them. The shape comes from the fact that both extremes are selected for during disruptive selection. The median is not a favorable trait or character in this case. Instead, it is desirable to have one extreme or the other with no preference over which extreme is better for the survival of that particular species. This is the rarest of the types of natural selection. Another one now is stabilizing selection. The most common of the type of natural selection is stabilization selection or stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, the median phenotype or the visible trait is the one selected during natural selection. This does not skew the bell curve in any way. Instead, it makes the peak of the bell curve even higher than what would be considered normal. So, stabilizing selection is the type of natural selection that human skin color follows. Most humans are not extremely light-skinned or extremely dark-skinned. The majority of the species fall somewhere in the middle of those 2 extremes. This creates a very large peak right in the middle of the bell curve. This is usually caused by a blending of traits through incomplete or codominance of the alleles. The next one is the sexual selection. Sexual selection is another type of natural selection. However, it tends to skew the phenotype ratios in the population, so they do not necessarily match what Gregor John Mendel has predicted for any given population. In sexual selection, the female of the species tends to choose mates based on a group traits that show that are more attractive. The fitness of the males is judged based on their attractiveness, and those who are found more attractive will reproduce more, and more of the offsprings will also have those traits. Now, another one is artificial selection. Artificial selection is not a type of natural selection, obviously, but it did help Charles Darwin obtain data for his theory of natural selection. Artificial selection mimics natural selection in that certain traits or characters are chosen to be passed down to the next generation. However, instead of nature or the environment in which the species lives being the deciding factor for which traits are favorable and which are not, it is humans that do the selecting of traits during artificial selection. All domestic plants and animals are products of artificial selection. Human selected which traits are the most beneficial for them. Dear students, let's understand relation between natural selection and the evolution of species. A prerequisite for natural selection to result in adaptive evolution, novel traits and speciation is the presence of heritable genetic variation that results in fitness differences. Genetic variation is the result of mutations, genetic recombinations and alterations in the karyotype, that is the number, shape, size and internal arrangement of the chromosomes. Any of these changes might have an effect that is highly advantageous or highly disadvantageous, but large effects are rare. In the past, most changes in the genetic material were considered neutral or close to neutral because they occurred in non-coding DNA or resulted in a synonymous substitution. However, many mutations in non-coding DNA have deleterious effects. Although both mutation rates and average fitness effects of mutations are dependent on the organism, a majority of mutations in humans are slightly deleterious. Most but not all mutations in regulatory genes result in non-viable embryos. Some non-lethal regulatory mutations occur in Hox genes in humans, which can result in a cervical rib or polydactyly, an increase in the number of fingers or toes. When such mutations result in a higher fitness, natural selection favors these phenotypes and the novel trait spreads in the population. Established traits are not immutable traits that have high fitness in one environmental context may be much less fit if environmental conditions change. In the absence of natural selection to preserve such a trait, it becomes more variable and deteriorate over time, possibly resulting in a vestigial manifestation of the trait or character, also called evolutionary baggage. In many circumstances, the apparently vestigial structure may retain a limited functionality or may be co-opted for other advantageous traits in a phenomena known as pre-adaptation. A famous example of a vestigial structure, the eye of the blind mole rat, is believed to retain function in photoperiod perception. In each environment, natural selection is likely to favor different traits, and other evolutionary forces such as random drift may also operate separately on the groups. Over many generations, differences in heritable traits or characters can accumulate between the groups to the extent that they are considered separate species now. Evolution by natural selection and other mechanisms underlies the incredible diversity of present-day life forms, and the action of natural selection can explain the fit between present-day organisms and their environments. Dear students, now the speciation. Speciation is the formation of a new and distinct species in the course of evolution. Speciation involves the splitting of a single evolutionary lineage into two or more genetically independent lineages which cannot interbreed. Speciation requires a degree of reproductive isolation that is a reduction in gene flow. However, it is instinct to the concept of a species that hybrids are selected against, opposing the evolution of reproductive isolation, a problem that was recognized by Darwin. The problem does not occur in allopatric speciation with geographically separated populations which can diverge with different sets of mutations. A.B. Polton realized in 1903 that reproductive isolation could evolve through divergence. If each lineage acquired a different incompatible allele of the same gene, selection against the heterozygote would then directly create reproductive isolation. With reinforcement, however, natural selection can favor an increase in prezygotic isolation, influencing the process of speciation directly. So reinforcement assists speciation by selecting against hybrids upon the secondary contact of two separated populations of a species. Dear students, let's now summarize the lecture. Natural selection acts on the phenotype, the characteristics of the organism which actually interact with the environment, but the genetic, that is heritable basis of any phenotype that gives the phenotype a reproductive advantage may become more common in a population. Over time, this process can result in populations that specialize for particular ecological niches or microevolution, and may eventually result in speciation, the emergence of a new species, that is macroevolution. In other words, natural selection is key process in the evolution of a population. The mechanism that Darwin proposed for evolution is natural selection. Because resources are limited in nature, organisms with heritable traits that favor survival and reproduction will tend to leave more offsprings than their peers, causing the traits to increase in frequency over generations. Natural selection causes populations to become adapted or increasingly well suited to their environments over a period of time. Natural selection depends on the environment and requires existing heritable variation in a group. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding selection, pattern, and mechanism. Hope you have understood it well. See you next time with a new topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye.